Now, after World War I, as we start to get into the 1920s, like 1923, the economy in the United States really starts to grow. Okay. For one, there's an expansion in production. More companies start using the assembly line, right? They start buying into Fordism. So you see mass production in a number of different industries, as well as mass consumption. Talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And US companies start to expand internationally during this time as well. You have American companies that are acquiring businesses overseas, right? Just straight up buying businesses overseas, expanding their territory, not just in the US anymore. Some will buy land overseas to try to exploit the resources of other countries, right? You see that happening in a number of countries in Latin America. American companies are also establishing plants overseas, right? So they're going to have their factories overseas where they can hire workers for lower wages, right? It makes sense. There's an incentive there. You also have US banks doing well overseas internationally, right? So US banks, especially headquartered in New York, are starting to expand their influence abroad as they're lending money to foreign countries after the war. Remember, Europe is in shambles, right? Because the war had devastated a number of countries there. And so France, Britain, Germany, they're all trying to get money or borrow money from banks, right? So that they could rebuild their countries, all right? The automobile. Right, we talked about Henry Ford and Fordism. The automobile is making huge changes in the United States as well, right? So now that people are mobile, they don't have to all live in the inner city. People can start moving out to the suburbs. And so you see a migration from the more urban areas to the suburbs, right? Because now people could drive to work. They could drive to the city. They could be farther away, right? You have automobiles also contributing to tourism, right? So people want to come to Southern California, see all the beautiful sights. So tourism is going to help build some economies of certain areas like Southern California. You have different markets that were far away from each other being more interconnected now because of cars, that people could drive to different areas. So goods can travel far distances on the roads, not just in trains. So basically you have more interconnection of the economy. You have the growth of a number of different industries that are related to automobiles as well, right? The rubber industry for tires, the steel industry for the body of the car, the oil industry for gas, right? So all these industries are benefiting from a mass amount of automobiles now being available to the public, okay? So many people are owning cars as we get into the 1920s. The US dollar also doing quite well internationally. It becomes the main standard of international trade, right? Whereas before it was the pound in Great Britain. That was the main currency being used around the world. Now the dollar becomes the most prominent currency. The US stock market also doing quite well in the 1920s, right? Until the end of the 1920s. We'll talk about that later when we get to the Great Depression. But yes, you have a lot of Americans owning stock during this time. Why? Because people want to get in on it. Right? There's money in it. Why? Because the stocks keep increasing in price. They're doing really, really well. So if you could buy some stock, even though it might be expensive, you're going to make some money in the stock market, right? So we'll talk more about that in just a minute, people buying stock. But it just seemed like it was going to keep getting better and improving more and more. Like the price of stocks are going to just keep climbing and climbing. And so it's like, why not invest? You know, do whatever you can to invest, right? So overall, after World War I, you have the economy doing quite well, right? As we get into the 1920s. But foreign policy of the United States is not so international, right? Where you have the economy is international, you have businesses expanding, right? But as far as politics go, the president at the time, as we get into the 1920s, Warren G. Harding, the early 20s, Warren G. Harding, President Harding, he was an isolationist. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about isolationism. What is that exactly? Well, isolationism is an American foreign policy, right? Harding is promoting this idea, and it would pretty much last through the 1920s and into the 1930s. And isolationism is a pretty dramatic shift from President Wilson's internationalism, right? He believed that America needs to reach out and intervene in other countries and get involved in the affairs of other countries. You know, World War I as well, we got involved in that. But Harding, President Harding, complete opposite. He says, no. You know what? After all this craziness of World War I, we need to get back to a normal life here. Okay, we got to return to normalcy. And so Harding is not going to really focus too much on foreign affairs. He's going to focus more on developing the economy of the United States. Okay, and Congress is going to follow suit. All right, so as I mentioned earlier in another module, the U.S. does not join the League of Nations after World War I. And so you just have the U.S. kind of closing itself off to the international world, except for U.S. businesses who are expanding overseas. Now, although it looks like the economy was doing quite well in the 1920s, farmers experienced some struggle, as well as urban workers who lacked proper representation as far as unions go. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about this. So a number of Americans were in debt during the 1920s. Even though everything was going good, they were taking out a bunch of loans, right? And we'll talk about exactly why. Well, there were so many new convenient and awesome appliances that were available at the time, right? Americans are going into debt to buy these things, right? So they're buying like a washing machine on an installment plan. You know, I'm going to pay little bits here and there, and you know, also pay interest on these installment plans to buy this appliance, which is too expensive for me to just buy all at once, right? So they're in debt, right? You have a number of Americans taking out loans, and there's huge inequalities in terms of income during the 20s, right? And it's kind of like the Gilded Age, right? Remember in the Gilded Age, around the end of the 1800s, the 1% were super wealthy and everyone else was not doing so well, right? They're pretty much living in poverty or not that wealthy. Well, that's how it is in the 1920s as well, right? The super rich are still super rich, and the rest, well, they can take out loans to kind of make up for it and get the cool stuff, right? Participate in the consumer economy, right? All right. So people are taking out loans, or maybe they're taking out extra mortgages on their homes. They need to, you know, buy appliances, they think, or they need farm equipment. Maybe they do actually need to spend some money, right? And so you have people taking out loans, but you also have people taking out loans to buy stock. Because remember, I told you that stocks are awesome at this time. You want to invest to the point where you're willing to take out a loan to get some stock because you feel like it's a good investment. You're going to make money, right? So a lot of people who bought stock, they bought it on margin. Okay, what does that mean? It means that they only pay a small portion of what the stock is actually worth up front. Okay, so if the stock's worth like $80, they may pay $10 up front. And the rest of the price of that stock is going to be borrowed from the stockbroker, right? They're going to borrow it from the stockbroker on credit. It's like a loan in a sense, you know, it's credit. Or they may actually take out a loan from a bank, or they may take out an extra mortgage on their house. Oh my God, to buy this stock, right? It's a good investment. You're going to get paid. The prices of the stocks are going to keep rising forever. It's going to be awesome, right? We'll get paid. Don't worry about it. Go into debt, you know? So that's what they're thinking, right? It's okay socially to do that. So you got this mass consumption trying to buy all of these cool new inventions that are available, and, you know, people going into debt because they want to participate in the stock market, okay? At the same time, you know, labor is not doing so well, because remember, before there was a movement to unionize. You have unions who are going on strike. Especially in 1919, there was this huge wave of strikes. There were general strikes in certain industries, trying to get better wages, better working conditions, right? And so they were organizing to try to get those things, but the labor movement is going to stagnate and actually go into decline in the 1920s. Mostly because of that wave of strikes in 1919, which were put down by authorities and by businesses, and they were just pretty much trying to destroy the labor movement. They arrested a bunch of the leaders of the labor unions, and that really hurt the labor unions. So eventually, you're going to see membership in the unions dropping, right, dramatically in the 1920s, and so ultimately, you're going to have not as many unions, not as much organization. In some cases, the businesses may try to help their employees and offer them some benefits, but that's not guaranteed, right? It's not like the government's guaranteeing that the business is going to do that. It's just the business deciding to do that. And some businesses may even have company unions, right? Where there's a union, but it's controlled by the business. It's not like an independent union. So ultimately, the whole labor rights movement is going to weaken during the 1920s. But don't worry, it will come back eventually. And also you have the issue of mechanization, right, which is going to lead some industrial workers to be losing their jobs. Okay, wouldn't it be nice if they had unemployment? But they don't have that yet, right? They're gonna have to wait a little while, right? So you have mechanization, which means like more and more jobs are being done by machines in the factories rather than human beings. And so not as many workers are needed in the factories because of that. And so workers are getting laid off. Okay, that's known as deindustrialization. Deindustrialization, meaning that not as many industrial workers have jobs because of the mechanization, right? Machines doing their jobs. And another aspect of mechanization has an impact also on the agricultural industry. Okay, why? Well, because yeah, now that you have these cool machines, you can actually increase farm production. You can make, more food, more crops, because you got all these machines to help you, right? It's more efficient. Great, awesome. But eventually, there is too much of a supply of this farm produce, too much food. And since there's so much on the world market and there's not as much of a demand starts to fall, and that causes prices to drop. Okay, so now there's all this farm produce and the price of that produce is falling and falling and falling. Farmers have lower and lower incomes because of that. They can't pay their loans off and they lose their land. Okay, so you have a lot of small farmers losing their farms during the 1920s. And so you see the rise, instead of small farms, you see the rise of factory farms. Okay, these large farms, huge farms that are producing a lot of food, and they're hiring a bunch of laborers to work on the farm, right? So low paid wage workers working on the farm. And so it's kind of driving small farmers out of business. You see, mechanization is driving small farmers out of business while also contributing to the rise of these factory farms, which are using machines and a lot of low-paid laborers to do the job. All right, yeah, eventually those factory farms are going to dominate the agricultural industry, right? Because remember, the U.S. used to be a nation of small farmers. That was the idea of what freedom was. Own your land, feed your family on your own, not work for somebody else. Well, small farmers are going out of business, and it's becoming a big industry where these large farms are dominating everything. And the last thing we'll talk about on this point is the McNary-Haugen bill. Okay, what does the McNary-Haugen bill do? Well, nothing, because it got vetoed by the president, Calvin Coolidge, at the time. A little later in the 20s, Coolidge is the president at the time. But what the McNary-Haugen bill would have did was allow government to buy farm produce. Okay. This would have helped small farmers out immensely, because government could buy the produce from the farmers, increase the price to help the farmers out of the produce, right? And then the government could take that produce and sell it internationally to other countries. Sounds like a good idea, right? It's going to help farmers increase their prices of their food. But the president at the time, Calvin Coolidge, does not think that the McNary-Haugen bill is a good idea, because he doesn't think that government should intervene in the economy. A good liberal economy should be free of government intervention, right? Let it do its own thing, laissez-faire, right? And so Calvin Coolidge is going to veto the McNary-Haugen bill 2 times, not just once, and small farmers are going to continue to be in a bad predicament.